Well, I think it has been long enough since EOC 2.0 has released, and combat seems to be pretty much the same thing since that update hit, so I think it is finally time to do the 3 main combat DPS guides. And today we will be looking at the melee combat style. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and get right into this guide. So what we'll be covering in this DPS guide is the abilities, any relevant set effects or special attacks or anything like that towards melee DPS, and some DPS rotations once we've explained everything. Later on, I will be doing more of a deep dive into the gear itself and how all of the gear works, but today we're just focusing on abilities, special attacks, EoFs, and how to put them all together in a rotation. Now, if you're new to this channel, I typically do high-end content or endgame content. Anyone who's been watching for a while will be quite aware of this fact, and this will be coming from a endgame perspective, but if you are still relatively new, there should be some information in here that you will be able to pick out, and some big picture ideas that will definitely help you out. Alright, I think I've covered all of the bases. Let's start with the melee abilities, and I'll bring up here on screen the entire melee ability book. This is it in all of its glory. Now, if you're playing before the recent combat update, there was a lot of abilities in game, but it has been chopped down quite a bit. And no longer do we have the threshold ability, they're now just called enhanced abilities, but we still have our basics and our ultimate and a category called utility, but there's only one in there. But we're gonna start off with the basic abilities. The very first one is literally called attack. That's it. Nothing special. This is like the necromancy ability or the necromancy basic. All combat styles have this button. There is no cooldown. It does cost a global cooldown, which for those who don't know, global cooldown is 1.8 seconds long or 3 game ticks, a game tick being 0.6 seconds. And it exists so that way you can't just like spam all of your abilities all at once and just like delete a boss, as funny as that would be. There are things that break this rule, but that's definitely for down the road, if not a completely different video. And if we look here at the tooltip, it generates a bloodlust stack. If you use the necromancy combat style before, the bloodlust stacks act pretty much exactly the same as necrosis stacks, except all basics I believe generate some amount of bloodlust stacks, and your thresholds will consume them to get some extra enhanced effects. But this ability, I have it on my bar just kind of as a filler here. By the way, up at the top, these are my personal action bars. One is a dual wield, the other is a two-handed bar, but I keep them on here just to fill out the ability bar. Honestly, I don't press basic all too often unless I've gone into like autopilot mode or I'm just killing some low level stuff trying to build adrenaline or something like that. But you should be using your other abilities in a rotation rather than using this basic, but you can keep it on your bar because we have room and it can be nice in some situations. The next basic ability is called Adaptive Strike, and this ability pretty much replaced Cleave and Decimate, and it has different effects based on whether you are using dual wield or two-handed weapons. Hence the name Adaptive Strike. It will change its effect based on what weapons you are using at the time. And if you have a two-handed on, it pretty much acts like Cleave and will kind of hit in a cone in front of you on multiple targets, whereas if you have dual wields on, it will give you 2 hits. The next ability here is called Rend. This ability generates 2 bloodlust stacks instead of 1. It works with the gloves of passage, which when you have those gloves equipped and you press this ability, your next ability, the first hit of it, will do, I believe it's 7% extra damage, or maybe it's 10%. So the standard gloves of passage will give you a 10% damage buff on the next ability, and the enhanced version will give you an additional 6%, and also any bleeds that you have active will do an additional 15% damage with the enhanced gloves for 10 seconds. Most of the time you're not going to be using the bleeds other than maybe in a couple melee camp situations, but it is a nice effect to know. And so far I haven't really been talking about the damage that they actually do. On all abilities you will see up at the top 135 to 165% 75% melee damage, or like adaptive strike was 2 hits of 60 to 75, 110 to 130%, and these numbers are used in calculations to give you actual ability damage numbers, and there's a lot of stuff that goes into it. Long story short, you can just kind of compare the abilities by saying bigger number is usually better, but then thinking about it in terms of either how much adrenaline it gives or how much it costs to be able to figure out which are the good abilities and which ones aren't. And speaking of adrenaline gain, Rend gives 9%, Adaptive Strike actually gives 12%, so that is nice if you're trying to build. The basic also only gives 9%, which will lead us into our next basic, which is Greater Fury. There is a lesser version of this ability, but I'm going to be talking about the greater one because that's the one I have. And this ability does pretty good damage for the adren it gains. It's pretty much the same as Adaptive Strike in terms of its damage, but the real reason you would press this ability is for its secondary effect, and that is it will guarantee a critical strike on your next ability. So saving this for something like an Overpower or a Hurricane, something like this is where this ability is going to come into play. And although it is kind of niche, it is definitely a good ability to have on your bar. After that, we have Backhand, which is the stun that we get for the melee combat style, and it doesn't do a whole lot of damage on its own. However, there are some things in game that you have to stun, and you get 2 charges of this, so you can press 2 of them back to back before it goes on a 15-second cooldown. And if you do space out this ability, like say for instance you press a backhand and then like 5 seconds later you press backhand again, it will not start the 15-second cooldown. Then the 15-second cooldown will start when you press the first one, so then you would only have to wait 10 seconds before you can press backhand again. And the game will also remember the amount of time in between pressing the 2 backhands, so it's not like you press it, you wait 5 seconds, press it again, you have your 10-second cooldown, and then you get both charges instantly back. They run essentially independent cooldowns, but there really shouldn't be any situation where you're running into cooldown issues using this ability. And something interesting about this ability specifically is it is affected by the flanking perk, and the flanking perk was updated to give a little bit more damage because we lost the threshold version of this ability. And with flanking, this ability is no joke. It does quite a lot of damage. So if you have like a flanking offhand, or if for whatever reason you decide to do a flanking easy K, you certainly have more GP than I do to be doing something like that. But technically in some situations it could be best in slot. So if you really want to go for it, have at it. The next ability on our list here is Punish. Punish on its own is not the greatest ability. However, when the target drops below 50% life points, this ability turns into an absolute monster of a basic. 110 to 130 isn't bad for a basic ability. It's not the greatest, but it's not the best, considering the basic attack does the same amount of damage. But as you can see in the text here, it says deals 2.5 times damage if the target's life points are below 50%. And I've seen this ability on low HP targets hit almost 30k inside of a Zerk. So this is definitely an ability you want somewhere on your action bar. Greater Barge of all of the basics probably has the most complexity to it, but the easy way to think about it, because staring at all of this text here can get quite confusing, the easy way to think about Barge is you wait 2 global cooldowns in a tick in order to press this ability, and then you have a small window in time, which again is 2 global cooldowns in 1 tick, to press either an assault or a greater flurry, and it will take either of those abilities, and instead of them being channeled, it turns them into a damage over time, meaning that ability is now going, it's doing its thing. You can now press abilities and you're kind of like doubling up on damage, so to speak. And also you can move up to 10 tiles towards a target that you're barging. So it's a movement ability. It has a secondary effect that allows you to use your thresholds in a unique way, and it also does more damage when you let it charge up. Now I'll pop over here to the live game real quick just to show you what I'm talking about, just to give you a visual, because this ability can be kind of confusing to people just trying to learn it. And when Barge is fully charged up, this is the icon I was talking about. This is what will show up here in your buff bar. But as soon as I just start attacking, you'll notice it goes away from my buff bar. And then if I stop attacking after this ability, there's the start, the first global cooldown, the second global cooldown, and the tick. The icon shows up, and then you're able to barge and then use the effect to your heart's content. Now, if you barge on the same game tick that this icon shows up, you will actually not get the barge effect. I'm not sure if this is a bug or it's just a limitation of the game tick system of being able to same tick barge. But for the timing window, when I do press barge here, say it's ready, if I mark a target here, you'll get this provoke symbol, and then you can wait till the last second and you will still bleed the ability. And again, that window of opportunity is 2 full global cooldowns and an additional game tick. Sometimes this is nice if you're trying to delay the barge, like if a boss is in an immune window or something like that, and you just want to delay that extra tick, so in theory, all of that bleed damage goes into the boss when it's not immune or under damage reduction or something. But I did want to include a small visual here because I do know that some people struggle with the idea of this ability, so hopefully that helped. But now we'll go back to the main screen here, and now we'll talk about the ability Chaos Roar. Now, Chaos Roar is a very unique but very niche ability, so to speak. However, if you can unlock it early, it is definitely something you should get. Although I think the codex is still like 150 or 200 mil at time of recording. I'm not sure exactly how much it is. And I think this ability used to literally be like chump change. So if you got it when it was cheap, congratulations, you have won. But if you have to buy it now, it is what it is, but it is definitely worth the cost. Because what this ability does is, it's not that strong on its own, is give whatever the next ability is a 1.75x damage multiplier. Now, this used to be 2 times, and effectively it still works the same in practice, but what they did with melee is brought all of the abilities up 25% in damage, and then they took Berserk down 25% in how much it buffs, and Chaos Roar was also brought into this so that you're still effectively getting the top end damage, but when you're out of Zerk, it's not doing as little damage for a combat style. That's why it says 1.75x here and not just a flat 2 times like it used to be. But this is something you would usually use with like a dagger EoF or an easy K spec or something like that. I will be explaining these abilities later, so if you don't know what I'm talking about, just keep watching. But Chaos Roar, definitely a strong ability. I would recommend having it fully. The last basic here is Bladed Dive, and this is a movement ability that happens to do damage in a small little AoE around you. The only place this ever really gets used is if you're not pool skipping for some reason at Raksha, so that would be like more of a med level player having to bladed dive the pools, because best in slot melee is so strong it can skip with a blindfold on, but I digress. Or if you want to do some type of movement, like if you're doing Solak routes in like a solo instance or something like that, you can then dive to the next route, and then when you kill the target, it will reset your dive cooldown, even if the target doesn't die from hitting hit. Even if the target doesn't die from getting hit by bladed dive, it's still useful for kind of zooming around places, and it only works with dual wield weapons. So if you're trying to do a bunch of like AoE stuff like an elite dungeon or something, it's not gonna work with the Tumikin's Light or a scythe or something like that unless you have laceration boots on, but I don't see anyone doing that really. So if you want to, have at it, but it is important to understand how this ability works, and it can be useful in some places. All right, we are now going to move on to the enhanced abilities, and this should go a little bit quicker because there are only 4 of them. Assault is now our bread and butter threshold that you're going to be pressing a decent amount because it is only a 6-second cooldown, and it's still pretty dang strong. However, this is one of the abilities that is affected by Bloodlust, and if you have 4 stacks, this ability will consume them and give quite a nice damage buff. Necrosis stacks and Necromancy help with adrenaline reduction on the Finger Blast ability. However, with melee, Bloodlust is just going to give you extra damage and extra effects on pretty much everything. And Assault under Bloodlust is definitely going to hit like a freight train in Zerk. This is probably going to be hitting 20 to 23k damage. So lining up a rotation with Bloodlust stacks is definitely going to be helpful. The next threshold is actually a two-handed threshold. It is Hurricane. And this is an AoE ability, but it does have some uses in single target because it is a solid ability that basically puts all of its damage out on the first hit, or the first tick, I should say. So if you're trying to kill something on that game tick and it's only at like 20k, usually with Bloodlust it will be able to do that. But how this works is whatever your main target is will take 2 hits instantly, with the second hit being stronger than the first one, and every other target around you depending on your weapon's attack range. So standard melee weapons being 1 tile, it'll be a 3x3 around you. If you have a halberd or a scythe, it'll be a 5x5. And it'll hit all of those targets up to 9 targets once. And if it's consuming Bloodlust, it'll give you an additional hit on the main target and an additional hit on all of the secondary targets. I have seen Chaos Roar Hurricane do quite a number on a few targets in elite dungeons, so in some niche AoE situations it is definitely something you can employ in your rotations. Also, the cooldown of this ability will get reduced by 3 seconds for every enemy you hit, essentially turning Hurricane into like the press the button to do AoE damage, and then if there's enough targets around you, you just press it again. Greater Flurry has basically taken all of the effects of the other thresholds that have been deleted from the game. It still remains its AoE effect, and it will hit all of its targets equally. Also, I should state all of the abilities that I've mentioned so far, including Greater Flurry, all consume 25% adrenaline, but Flurry has its AoE, and instead of reducing Zerk cooldown, it now extends your Zerk by 1 game tick per hit, essentially pausing your Zerk timer, because it'll do a hit every game tick for 8 hits, and then Zerk's going to be going down by 1 game tick for all 8 of those hits, so it all cancels out and you're just getting free time under Zerk. It also stuns and binds targets for 3.6 seconds, acting kind of like Destroy did back in the day. So this is just kind of a jack of all trades threshold, but the cooldown is a lot longer at 20.4 seconds. And all Bloodlust does for this ability is gives you extra damage based on how much HP is left on the target, kind of like how Punish works. And I believe the threshold for Assault to be worse damage than Flurry overall is at around 60 or 61% health remaining on your target. So if you're fighting something that's 1,000,000 HP at around 610k, somewhere in that range, you would want to start using Bled Flurry or as many flurries as you could instead of an Assault. You'll still want to use Flurry anyway in your Zerk rotations because of the Zerk extend, but if you're outside of it in like a ZGS spec or something at lower HP values on that target, you will want to use Flurry. Now the last ability here in the enhanced section is the Bleed ability. Now this one works how the Scythe abilities do with Necromancy. There's kind of a odd irony how Necromancy on its 1 button that you press 3 times to get 3 sequential effects is Cleave, Hurricane, and Meteor Strike, and then melee as a combat style, its bleeds are using that same mechanism in order to do them all at once. So you keybind this to whatever slot you want. I happen to have it on S, so you press it once, you get Dismember, you press it again, you get a Slaughter, and then you press it it a third time and you get Massacre. Now for Slaughter, they just buffed the damage and got rid of the whole walk under mechanic, which I thought the walk under was kind of a cool mechanic in order for getting the damage out of something like that, but it is what it is. Obviously it's not going to change at this point, so we'll just move on. And Massacre, I believe they buffed the damage because Massacre was really bad. You would never press it beforehand, but I think what they did is they cut the adrenaline cost way down and then increased the damage a little bit. But essentially these are your 3 bleeds. We don't have blood tendrils anymore, so if you have a Masterwork Spear, it will extend all 3 of these abilities duration by 50%. So you can just simply think of this as, okay, equip Spear, press this button until I can't press it anymore, then go back to other weapons. Alrighty, now we're going to talk about the fun abilities, and that is the ultimates. Overpower is quite literally overpowered, and that's not me doing a pun or anything. This is just literal fact. And that is because on its own, with the Igneous Cal Zuck Cape or even the standard Zuck Cape from normal mode, you get 2 hits of quite a lot of damage, and it only costs 60% adrenaline. So that's already very strong on its own. However, if you're inside of a Zerk, this cooldown gets reduced to 9 seconds. And so you just get 4 of these inside a Zerk, and it is an absurd amount of damage. It is bombastic levels of damage. MLRS eat your heart out levels of damage. Okay, I'm getting off track here. The main point is this is a very strong ability. You're going to be pressing it a lot in Zerk, and it's going to kind of dominate your Berserk rotation, but it does 2 hits of a lot of damage. Some people will make the mistake of Chaos Roaring this ability. It absolutely does not need a Chaos Roar attached to it. It will do plenty of damage just fine because we have this thing in game called the hit cap, where at 30k damage you are no longer able to go over that. And if we didn't have hit cap, then yeah, you would definitely want to Chaos Roar this, but we have hit caps in the game, so please never use Chaos Roar with this ability. It will do plenty of damage on its own. The next ultimate is Pulverize. Now what Pulverize does is it gives you a 25% damage reduction for 30 seconds. It is the same damage as Overpower, except it is only 1 hit, not 2. In the window of damage on this ability, technically it has a slightly higher floor at 300% instead of 280, but just think of this as a single hit Overpower that gives you damage reduction for 30 seconds. And if you kill something with this ability, you are then granted 50% adrenaline, which can then be affected by things like Natural Instinct or other effects, or it can be worked in with the Vestments effect. You might be thinking, oh wow, whoop-de-doo, it's 60%, but that's 60% base cost. So if you have the passive Ring of Vigor, if you kill something with this, you're already back, so to speak. It's a net neutral. And if you have something like COE, then that's a positive 10% gain, so on and so forth. It will also trigger with the Vestments effect. So if it pulls 20% adrenaline because you're on the right number of ultimates, then you're kind of understanding the picture here. The generates 50% adrenaline is one of the more slept on things in all of Melee. It is very, very useful. Next on the list, we have Meteor Strike, and this ability used to be the crit buffing ultimate that essentially back then what it would do is every time you critical strike, it would give you 8% adrenaline, but that is no longer the case. How this ability now works is once you press it, every single game tick you will generate 4.5% adrenaline. It still maintains its AoE effects from earlier versions of this ability, so anything in your weapon's attack range, so any normal weapon, a 3x3, a halberd, or a scythe, a 5x5, it will hit all of those with a 220 to 250%, so think of it as a slightly weaker Pulverize hit on everything. But this ability, the main effect that everyone's going to want from it is the generating generating a bunch of adren every game tick. And last but certainly not least, we have the ability Berserk. This ability defines Melee. It is still one of the most unique ultimates in game, where you literally go Berserk and all of your abilities do 1.75x damage. It also increases the amount of damage taken by 25%. The ability itself will generate 4 Bloodlust stacks, and any ability that generates Bloodlust stacks will then double the amount that they generate. It also lets you hold up to 8 Bloodlust stacks instead of 4, and like I said before, it reduces the overpower cooldown to 9 seconds. Now here it says the duration is 19.8 seconds, but if you have the full 4-piece vestment set, this goes up to 26%. And if you factor in 2 flurries, you're getting well over 30 seconds of Berserk time. It is quite insane how long this ability can last and how much damage a Zerk rotation can now do. Now it has a 1-minute cooldown, so you're able to get a lot of time under this ability, but you're not going to be able to have it up the entire time for its cooldown, so you will have to do things in between the time of Zerk going away and its cooldown letting you press it again, but we will get into that a little bit later on. The final ability here in the utility section is called Dive, and it is just a non-combat movement only version of Bladed Dive. Dive does not give you a global cooldown, whereas Bladed Dive does, so most people are going to have this keybound instead of BD, and that's how I have it set up on all of my action bars, so this is strictly just a movement ability and nothing more. It is also the only ability in the melee set where you do not need to have a melee weapon equipped in order to use it. Alright, that was a lot of talk on abilities, but now we're going to be covering the relevant weapon special attacks and EoFs that you will want for your melee rotations. So moving on to the special attacks and EoFs, I'm going to keep this one relatively small because there are a few other special attacks and there are many hyper niche EoFs that Melee has, but I'm going to keep it to the main ones. And starting out, we're going to be talking about the Leng Swords. They have a passive and a special attack that work together, and how they work together is the passive builds stacks, the special attack consumes said stacks, and then each have their own list of benefits. So how the Leng Swords build up passive stacks, the stacks are called Primordial Ice stacks, and how this works is every single hit you have roughly a 12% chance when both swords are equipped in order to gain a stack, and you can build up to 10 of these Primordial Ice stacks. And when you gain one of these stacks, you will have a additive damage buff for about 10 seconds. Now in this video, I'm not going to be going into like how additive or multiplicative or percentage based damage buffs work and all the intricate details on that. That will be a future video. And what the special attack does is, depending on how many stacks you have, it will save adrenaline, because the base cost of the special attack is 30%, but once you have 3 stacks, this effectively becomes a 0 cost ability, and the more stacks you have, the more damage it will do. It will basically act like a hurricane, where you hit the main target with 2 large hits, and then anything else in a 3x3 around you is going to be hit once. However, if you're zerked in, I think if you have anything over 7 stacks, you're pretty much going to hit the hit cap, although sometimes that won't happen. But honestly, anything 3 and above I think is a worthwhile press, regardless if you're doing something that is AoE or single target. And when you use the special attack, it will consume all of the stacks, resetting you back to 0, and then you'll keep building them up more and more. The other main weapon that has a very useful special attack for melee is the EZK. And again, this sword has a passive effect and it has a special attack that work together in order to benefit each other. Now, how this works is the first time you use the special attack, that will mark the target with Flamebound Rival, and you'll see an icon in the debuff bar of the boss you're fighting. And while you attack that target with your EZK equipped, a passive will pop up and you will do 12% additional damage to the marked target, and you will take 12% less damage from said target. And when you do your first special attack to mark a target, you will hit a single, roughly, it's like I think a 24 or 25k, sometimes it's a 30k. But if you special attack again on a marked target, you will get 3 additional hits of that special attack. And this is where you'll see people do Chaos Roar into easy K spec, and all of a sudden you just see 120k of life points just gone from the target. It's this special attack in its buffed form. Earlier on, this sword had a lot more passive effects, like reducing the adrenaline cost of Pulverize and working with Smash, and there was one other ability I believe it would work on. However, all of that got moved into the abilities themselves, and Easy K just focuses on marking a target and doing a bunch of damage on said marked target. The special attack initially cost 50% adrenaline, however, when you use it on a marked target, you will then gain 15% back, giving you an overall cost of 35%. By far, the most popular and most versatile special attack that Melee has to offer is the Mercy Dagger. This dagger will hit your target 3 times inside of 1 global cooldown, and each continuous hit, or each successive hit, I should say, will give you additional crit chance and critical strike damage, pretty much building itself up so the 3rd hit is just a massive one. The first 2 hits are kind of weak. However, this EoF is the one you're most likely to pair with Chaos Roar, unless you're really needing the 120k delete from Easy K, because you are gaining more benefit from this. So you'll see people comboing this a lot and then just going with something like Rend for their Easy K. It mainly depends on the boss you're doing, but this is a very worthwhile dagger. Now, I have to mention, if you're going to go off and do some type of equilibrium setup, this dagger becomes borderline useless, and something like Dragon Claws will then become best in slot, but I don't do anything with equilibrium at all, and it's not something I'm going to be including in this DPS guide. But I did want to make mention of that for those who might be curious. The next EoF here I have, it's a very large technicality, and if you're a little bit strapped for GP, you don't need to put this inside of an EoF. I have it inside of an EoF, and so that's why I've put it in this section, but that would be the ZGS spec. You can think of the ZGS spec as like a lesser version of Sunshine, but it's for the melee combat style. It makes a 7x7 area on the location that you plant it, and you deal an additional 25% damage for 20 seconds. And the reason it technically should go in an EoF is it does little hits if the target is within its range, just like Sunshine does, and just like Death Swiftness used to do before it got moved to a self buff. And those little hits are affected by weapon tier, since ZGS is a tier 92, and then Easy K or Lang Swords with the Shard of Genesis Essence is a tier 100. Those hits will get buffed by this item being in an EoF. However, the damage is so small, it's again very much a technicality. I happen to have it inside of an EoF because I'm kind of pedantic about stuff like that, but you could easily just keep this sword as is and have no issues. The last EoF here is not used in all melee rotations, but you will see it in some of them on different rotations for different bosses, and that is the Annihilation EoF. Gravitate is the official name, but the Annihilation special attack costs 60% adrenaline base, and for every hit you do, you gain 1% damage increase up to a maximum of 20 stacks. The only thing that is slightly annoying about this EoF is you have to use it with the weapon that you want to use for the duration that it's there, because even swapping to a two-handed or a dual-wield weapon, one weapon swap, even if it is a melee weapon, it will completely cancel the effect. This is usually used in some form of pre-build or a waiting period during a boss, like when doing range melee Vorkath, like I made a video on before. You use the Annihilation while you're building up to kill Zamorgil, and the extra 20% damage comes in quite handy. Alrighty, that is enough discussion on abilities, special attacks, EoFs, and that sort of stuff. There are many more niche EoFs that you can have for melee, but those are on a more of a need to know basis rather than a should know basis. And now we will move on to the rotations. This is a quick editor's note here. You may have noticed on some of the live portions where I'm explaining something here at Wars Dummies, or this last portion of the EoF explanations, that the quality is a bit worse than usual. For some reason, my output video on OBS went back to 1080p instead of being at 1440p like it normally is. I have fixed this issue, but the next clip was recorded in 1080, so it's not your monitor going fuzzy or anything wrong with YouTube. It was just the fact that for some reason it defaulted settings. Alrighty, we are here at the Combat Dummies, and we are going to now do some melee rotations. Now, I've purposely kept my inventory here pretty simple, so that way there isn't a bunch of extra stuff trying to confuse people as if I just pulled like one of my presets. And this rotation is going to be pretty similar to ones I have done in the past. My melee rotations have not changed a whole lot, but some of y'all probably haven't watched those past videos, which is fine because they were kind of temporary, and this one is the full-on DPS guide. Also, I don't remember if I mentioned it earlier in the video, but I will be doing separate videos for gear and whatnot. And the big picture idea for any rotation in general, but melee is included in this, is we are going to focus all of our efforts around our self-buff ultimate. For melee's case, it is Berserk, and that is because it gives the gigantic damage increase, and so we're going to optimize our damage around this. Now, it is a 1-minute cooldown, but it only lasts 26 seconds with vestments by default. With 2 greater flurries, it will increase for duration, but it's not going to get us all the way to 1 minute, and that is where we will pull the ZGS out and do a little bit of in-between damage while building back up for a Zerk. And I'll be theming this around the idea of you're going into a boss instance. So you would normally start here at an adrenaline crystal and then grab your adrenaline, run into whatever boss you happen to kill. We're just going to be doing this on the DPS dummies, but what I usually do is I will go ahead and stall an EZK and then grab some more adrenaline here. And I have a video on stalling. I'll probably go ahead and update that soon enough. But then whenever I get to my boss or whatever I do, I would go ahead and target cycle to release it and then press Meteor Strike, do an Anticipate, do a Berserk, and then Barge, hit an Overpower. My dual wields bleed the Flurry and hit an Assault. Let that play out. We'll go ahead and hit Rend, another Overpower, and another Assault. And here we're going to Chaos Roar and hit a Dagger EoF. Then another Overpower, another Rend, and then a Flurry. Maybe another ability into an Overpower, and then a Hurricane to finish it off. Then let's go ahead and build some Adrenaline here. And then go for our ZGS EoF. You hit another ability, another basic, maybe an A-Pot here, and then an Assault. I'm not going to be using Overpower in this. Maybe we'll go for a Hurricane. G-Fury into a Meteor. Then we'll just go ahead and build up from here. And then I'm going to go ahead and Anticipate. Do another Zerk. And then now I'll do pretty much the same thing here. Except we're going to have the EZK spec this time, the big one. So we bleed our G-Fury. We'll go ahead and hit our Assault. Do another Rend. Hit an Overpower. And then go into another Assault. And then here we will Chaos Roar and then press EZK instead of the Dagger. Another Overpower. Hit another Rend, swap to our dual wields for a greater Flurry. And then here I'm going to go ahead and hit G-Fury, another Overpower, and then do a Hurricane. And that is a pretty rough example of what I have been doing rotation-wise for melee as a long version. Most bosses, you're not going to be able to just sit there and attack for that long like that, but I wanted to give an extended rotation here just so you guys can see that we are focusing on doing a Zerk rotation. Our ZGS is our filler in between both Zerks, but as soon as Zerk is ready to go, as soon as we have Meteor Strike ready to go to give us that adrenaline, we are prepping, we are building for it, and we are going to send that rotation. And with all that yapping out of the way, that is just a general rotation. Now, Certain bosses are going to require different rotations because, like I said before, you're not going to have all of that time to just sit there and whack a bunch of abilities on bosses. You will have certain damage windows because mechanics are happening. Invulnerability periods are a thing in bosses now where it'll just say immune, and you can't attack it. You have to do some type of mechanic. And what I like to do in those instances, if I have something up or if I need to press something like devotion or do something else, is I like to use Hurricane as a way to still manage my bloodlust stacks and get good damage out, but I'm not using Assault in that case because Assault is a full channel. That takes time, whereas Hurricane is just a one and done ability. It's good damage with full bloodlust stacks, but it gives you the time to go ahead and press something like a Devotion or a Res or a Reflect or a Barricade if you need that for some reason. And learning these different rotations or backup rotations and figuring things out, that is the entire draw of combat in RuneScape, is just going out there, putting yourself into some boss encounters and putting yourself to the test, dying a bunch of times to then figure out a new rotation and then accomplish the goal of eventually farming the boss or getting a combat achievement, whatever your goals happen to be. And that's all I really have to say about this topic.